Europe, late summer 1939. Airfields across the continent hum with engines that sound familiar: radial pistons, propellers cutting thick air, designs refined but fundamentally unchanged since the last war. Generals and air marshals stand convinced that they understand the sky. They believe air power has reached maturity. Speed can still be improved. Bomb loads increased, but the rules themselves feel settled. No one yet realizes how fragile that certainty truly is. Between the two world wars, air power doctrine hardened into orthodoxy. Strategic bombing advocates argued that fleets of bombers could bypass armies and navies altogether, striking directly at industrial centers and civilian morale. Fighters, in this vision, existed mainly as escorts, defensive tools, rather than decisive weapons. According to interwar planning documents, many air staffs believed that the bomber will always get through, a phrase often paraphrased rather than quoted, but widely reflected in official thinking. The assumption shaped everything from aircraft design to pilot training. These ideas were not born from fantasy. The First World War had shown how quickly aircraft evolved under pressure. By 1918, air combat had already transformed from observation flights into a brutal, three-dimensional battlefield. But the war ended before theory could fully catch up to experience. In the 1920s and 1930s, nations filled that gap with peacetime logic exercises, simulations, and limited conflicts that reinforced existing beliefs rather than challenging them. Technology seemed to support the consensus. Propeller-driven aircraft were improving steadily, but incrementally. Faster engines demanded stronger airframes. Stronger airframes added weight. Each gain introduced a trade-off. Engineers pushed against the physical limits of wood, aluminum, and piston power. The result was a sense that aviation had entered a plateau: impressive, lethal, but ultimately predictable. Human experience reinforced this illusion. Pilots trained for dogfights that emphasized maneuver and visibility. Bomber crews practiced tight formations, trusting in overlapping fields of defensive fire. Ground crews refined maintenance routines that assumed mechanical familiarity. The entire system, industrial, tactical, psychological, was optimized for a known kind of war. Even fear became familiar. Aviators expected danger, but they expected it in recognizable forms. When war arrived in September 1939, early campaigns appeared to validate these assumptions. Air forces played decisive roles, but within expected boundaries. Bombers struck cities and rail hubs. Fighters contested airspace above advancing armies. Losses were heavy but comprehensible. Reports from Poland, France, and the Low Countries reinforced the belief that control of the air depended on numbers, training, and coordination, not radical transformation. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. Combat exposed flaws that doctrine struggled to explain. Bombing accuracy fell dramatically under fire. Fighter escorts lacked the range to protect bombers deep into enemy territory. Air defense's radar, centralized control. Improved anti-aircraft guns proved far more effective than pre-war planners had anticipated. According to wartime operational analyses, attrition rates in some bomber units exceeded levels considered sustainable even in total war. The strain was not only technical, it was human. Crews flew night after night into environments that punished predictability. Fatigue accumulated. Confidence eroded. Diaries and letters from airmen across all combatant nations describe a growing sense that the sky itself was becoming hostile, less a domain to be mastered than a gauntlet to be survived. By 1941, Airpower stood at a crossroads. It had proven indispensable, yet insufficient. It could devastate cities, but not always break resistance. It could support armies, but not guarantee victory. The balance of the war remained unsettled, and the cost of maintaining air superiority was climbing faster than anyone had planned. In laboratories, test fields, and design bureaus far from the front lines, a different kind of thinking was beginning to stir. Engineers confronted the same limitations pilots felt in combat. Propellers, they realized, were not just tools, they were constraints. Speed increases produced diminishing returns. Altitude demanded sacrifices elsewhere. According to surviving development reports, several research teams began exploring propulsion methods that ignored the propeller altogether. At first, these ideas were peripheral, experimental, underfunded, often dismissed. Wartime urgency prioritized production over revolution. But the pressure of combat has a way of accelerating the unthinkable. As losses mounted and expectations collapsed, military planners grew more willing to gamble on solutions that had once seemed impractical. By the middle years of the war, the familiar sky was no longer enough. Airpower needed something new, something faster, higher, and fundamentally different. The assumptions that had governed aviation since 1918 were beginning to crack, and when they finally broke, the balance of the war would break with them. Endpoint arrived quietly, not with a single battle, but with accumulating evidence that the old rules no longer worked. By late 1941 and early 1942, air commanders across all major powers faced the same unsettling truth. Airpower, as it was understood, could not deliver decisive results without unacceptable loss. The promise of domination had collided with reality. Combat reports revealed the scale of the problem. Daylight bombing formations suffered devastating attrition when unescorted. Night bombing reduced losses but sacrificed accuracy. Fighter units found themselves stretched thin, forced to defend cities, escort bombers, and support ground forces simultaneously. According to wartime staff assessments, no Air Force possessed enough aircraft or trained crews to do all three effectively at once. This imbalance reshaped strategy. In Britain, the shift toward area bombing was not born of cruelty alone, but of limitation. Precision had proven elusive under fire. In Germany, defensive fighter forces were increasingly tied to homeland protection, draining strength from offensive operations. In the Pacific, vast distances magnified every technical weakness, turning range and reliability into life or death variables. For the men in the air, these strategic adjustments translated into relentless strain. Bomber crews flew missions knowing survival depended as much on luck as skill. Fighter pilots faced exhaustion as sortie rates climbed. Medical officers documented rising cases of combat fatigue then poorly understood, often stigmatized and rarely treated. The sky demanded more than bodies could easily give. The industrial response was immense, but constrained by physics. Factories produced faster propeller aircraft with heavier armament and stronger armor. Yet every improvement deepened the same dilemma. Weight reduced range, power increased maintenance demands, and speed magnified structural stress. Engineers were improving machines that were already approaching their natural limits. By 1942, this reality forced uncomfortable questions. If air power was essential but insufficient, what would tip the balance? More planes? Better crews? Tighter formations? Or something altogether different? Some answers came incrementally. Radar-guided interception networks improved coordination. Long-range escort fighters began to appear, narrowing the bomber protection gap. Training programs adapted, emphasizing survivability over doctrine. These measures mattered. They saved lives, but they did not redefine the battlefield. Others searched for transformation. In research facilities scattered across Europe and the United States, propulsion experiments long considered impractical began receiving attention. According to surviving technical correspondence, engineers increasingly agreed on one point: propellers were the bottleneck. To go faster, higher, and farther while carrying meaningful payloads, aviation would have to abandon them. The idea was not new. Concepts for jet propulsion dated back decades. But peacetime budgets, conservative leadership, and technical uncertainty had kept them on the margins. War changed that calculus. Desperation made room for risk. Losses made room for innovation. Crucially, these efforts unfolded largely out of public view. While newspapers celebrated familiar aircraft and aces, test pilots quietly pushed experimental machines down runways at remote airfields. Failures were frequent. Engines flamed out. Airframes vibrated violently. Several early test flights ended in crashes that never reached official communities. Progress came measured in meters per second, not victories. Yet the implications were enormous. A propulsion system that eliminated the propeller promised more than speed. It offered altitude unreachable by conventional fighters, interception windows too short for defenders to react, and performance envelopes that rendered existing doctrine obsolete. If it worked, by late 1943, senior planners began to grasp what this could mean. According to post-war interviews, some commanders initially viewed jet aircraft as curiosities, useful perhaps, but too late to matter. Others sensed something more dangerous, a weapon that could not simply be countered. With more of the same, the human dimension never disappeared. Test pilots described the experience as both exhilarating and terrifying. Unfamiliar sounds, delayed throttle response, aircraft that behaved nothing like the machines they had mastered. One pilot report from this period notes simply, "The aircraft does not forgive hesitation." It was a new kind of flying, demanding new instincts. As the war ground on, air power stood on the edge of reinvention. The propeller era had reached its limits under the weight of global conflict. The next step was uncertain, fragile, and unproven, but it was coming. The assumptions that once ruled the sky were already obsolete. The question was no longer whether air power would change the war, but how radically, and who would get their first dot in the next chapter. The story moves from doctrine to invention, from theory to flame, as the first operational jets race from drawing boards toward combat carrying with them. The future of warfare itself, *Germany, 1939 to 1941, while Europe burns and air battles rage above familiar front lines. A quieter struggle unfolds behind factory walls and guarded airfields. It is not fought for territory or cities, but for velocity itself. Engineers, working under secrecy and pressure, are attempting something that defies decades of aviation instinct flight powered, not by spinning blades, but by continuous fire. Jet propulsion did not emerge suddenly from wartime desperation. Its roots stretched back into the uneasy calm after the First World War, when engineers across several countries began questioning the limits of piston engines. Propellers worked by brute interaction with air. They were efficient up to a point, but as aircraft grew faster, propeller tips approached the speed of sound, generating shockwaves that wasted energy and threatened structural failure. According to pre-war aeronautical studies, this was not a problem that refinement could solve. It was a wall. In Germany, the individual who pursued that wall most relentlessly was Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain, a physicist rather than a traditional aircraft engineer. As early as the mid-1930s, von Ohain proposed a propulsion system that compressed air, mixed it with fuel, ignited it, and expelled the exhaust directly to produce thrust. No propeller, no mechanical translation, just reaction. It was elegant in theory and deeply problematic in practice. Early prototypes barely functioned. Materials failed under heat. Compressors surged unpredictably. Fuel delivery proved unstable. According to surviving test records, early engines produced thrust for seconds before shutting down or destroying themselves. In peacetime, such results might have ended the program. In wartime Germany, they earned cautious backing. The Luftwaffe leadership remained divided. Traditionalists saw jet engines as unreliable distractions from proven aircraft desperately needed at the front. Others, particularly within research and development circles, saw jets as a leapfrog technology, something that could bypass Allied numerical superiority rather than compete with it. Funding remained limited, but it continued. By 1939, progress reached a critical threshold. On August 27th, at Rostock-Mariehamn, a small experimental aircraft powered by a jet engine lifted off the runway. The flight was brief, controlled, and historic. According to test reports, it confirmed what theory had promised. Sustained jet-powered flight was possible. The sky had changed, even if no one outside the airfield knew it yet. Human cost accompanied every step. Test pilots volunteered for aircraft that behaved unpredictably, with delayed throttle response and no margin for error. One misjudgment during landing could be fatal. Ground crews worked without manuals, inventing procedures as engines evolved. Failures were accepted as data. Accidents were absorbed into silence. As the war expanded, so did pressure. By 1941, Allied bombing intensified, and German aircraft losses mounted. Fighter pilots demanded speed. Anything that could close on enemy bombers faster, climb higher, escape pursuit. Propeller designs were stretched to their limits. According to Luftwaffe internal assessments, even the most advanced piston fighters were nearing performance ceilings that no amount of incremental improvement could break. Jet aircraft promised exactly what was needed on paper: speeds unmatched by existing fighters, climb rates that rendered interception tactics obsolete. But promise alone could not overcome production reality. Engines still lacked durability. Fuel consumption was extreme. Manufacturing tolerances required skills and materials already strained by war. Even so, development accelerated. Aircraft designers began shaping airframes around engines that barely existed yet, gambling that propulsion would catch up. Airfields were modified. Training syllabi drafted for aircraft no pilot had yet flown operationally. It was a race not just against the enemy, but against time itself. By late 1942, the jet was no longer an experiment, it was a commitment. Germany had chosen to pursue a future aircraft while fighting a present war. The decision carried enormous risk. If jets arrived too late, they would change nothing. If they arrived early enough, they might change everything. What followed would test not just technology, but strategy, leadership, and the men who would be asked to take these machines into combat with minimal preparation. The jet age was igniting. Whether it would burn bright or burn out remained uncertain. The commitment to jet propulsion transformed German aviation from cautious experimentation into a gamble under fire. By 1943, the war's momentum had shifted decisively against Germany, and the jet, once a scientific curiosity, was reframed as a potential salvation. The question was no longer whether jets could fly, but whether they could be built, maintained, and fought in numbers before defeat arrived. Operational reality intruded quickly. Jet engines consumed fuel at alarming rates, and Germany's fuel situation was already deteriorating under Allied bombing and blockade. Materials posed another challenge. High-temperature alloys needed for reliable turbines were scarce, forcing engineers to substitute inferior metals that reduced engine lifespan. According to production assessments, early jet engines were often rated for only a handful of operational hours before requiring replacement. For pilots, the transition was brutal. Training time was minimal. Many were combat veterans accustomed to piston fighters, suddenly confronted with aircraft that responded slowly to throttle changes and punished impatience. Landing speeds were significantly higher. Engine flameouts were common. One training directive warned pilots explicitly that standard fighter instincts may prove fatal. Survival depended on unlearning habits formed over years of combat. Despite these dangers, the first operational jet units were formed. Their existence alone altered Allied calculations. Intelligence reports noted aircraft that appeared suddenly, attacked with unprecedented speed, and vanished before escorts could react. Bomber crews described encounters that felt unreal: brief flashes of metal and fire, then silence. The psychological impact far outweighed the numbers involved. Yet jets could not escape the constraints of war. Limited production meant few aircraft. Maintenance crews struggled to keep engines running under field conditions. Airfields became high-value targets, and jets were most vulnerable on the ground, where their advantages meant nothing. According to post-war analysis, more jet aircraft were destroyed during takeoff, landing, or servicing than in air combat. Leadership decisions compounded the strain. Conflicting priorities: interceptor versus bomber roles, dispersal versus concentration, slowed deployment and diluted effectiveness. Some jets were diverted to missions they were ill-suited to perform, sacrificing their strengths without compensating gains. Historians continue to debate whether different strategic choices could have altered their impact. Though most agree the window was already closing, the human cost mounted quietly. Pilots died in accidents rarely publicized. Ground crews worked under constant threat of air attack, improvising repairs with inadequate tools. Diaries and letters from this period reveal a mixture of pride and fatalism, a sense of flying the future while losing the present. By 1944, jets were undeniably reland, undeniably too late. They disrupted Allied operations, forced tactical adjustments, and demonstrated what air combat would soon become. But they could not reverse the strategic balance. Air superiority depended on systems, fuel, training, production, logistics that jets alone could not conjure into existence. Still, their legacy was immediate. Allied engineers studied captured aircraft with urgency. Test pilots flew them within weeks. Reports circulated rapidly, stripping away myth and extracting lessons. The jet's value was no longer hypothetical. It was proven, flawed, and inevitable. When the war ended, the jet did not disappear with it. Instead, it spread across borders, doctrines, and decades. The machines born in desperation became the foundation of post-war air power, reshaping military planning and geopolitics alike. The propeller era had ended not with a triumph, but with an admission of limits. Fire without propellers had rewritten the sky. And as the world absorbed that lesson, a new contest began, one that would push jet technology beyond speed and altitude, toward total dominance of the air. By 1943, The war in the air had become a contest not just of courage or numbers, but of reach. Bombers could strike deeper than ever before. Fighters could climb faster, dive harder, and kill more efficiently. Yet one limitation continued to decide who lived and who died above the clouds' range. The horizon itself had become a battlefield, and whoever could cross it safely would shape the war's outcome. Early air power doctrine had underestimated distance. Pre-war planners assumed wars would be short, targets nearby, and bases secure. Reality erased those assumptions. Strategic bombing demanded penetration hundreds of miles into defended territory. Escort fighters, designed for speed and agility, often lacked the fuel to stay with bombers to the target and back. According to operational summaries from the early war years, bomber losses spiked sharply at the point where escorts were forced to turn home. This gap created a deadly rhythm. Bomber crews learned to recognize the moment protection vanished. Beyond that invisible line, enemy fighters attacked with impunity. Formation discipline tightened. Gunners scanned empty sky with mounting dread. Survival hinged on flak patterns, cloud cover, and chance. No amount of bravery could compensate for fuel gauges ticking toward zero. Attempts to solve the problem came in stages. External fuel tanks extended range, but reduced performance and were often jettisoned early in combat. Navigation errors wasted precious fuel. Engines optimized for speed burned more than planners anticipated. According to engineering reports, escort fighters were being asked to do the impossible to be fast, maneuverable, heavily armed, and long-ranged, all at once. The human consequences were stark. Loss rates among bomber crews climbed to levels that commanders privately acknowledged were unsustainable. Replacement crews arrived faster, trained faster, and died faster. Letters home reveal growing awareness that survival odds were shrinking with each mission. Morale did not collapse, but it hardened into something colder, more fatalistic. By mid-1943, the strategic implications were undeniable. Bombing campaigns could not achieve their objectives without escorts that could stay the course. Air superiority could not be localized. It had to be continuous from takeoff to landing. This was not a tactical adjustment. It was a structural demand. Jet aircraft, still rare and unreliable, offered speed but not endurance. Early designs consumed fuel at rates that made long-range escort impractical. According to developmental assessments, jets excelled as interceptors, not companions. They could slash through enemy formations, but not loiter beside them. The horizon remained just out of reach. The answer, paradoxically, did not come from revolution alone, but from refinement guided by desperation. Engineers revisited airframe efficiency, engine tuning, and fuel management with new urgency. Air forces re-examined mission profiles, altitudes, and formations. Doctrine bent under pressure. One aircraft, in particular, embodied this shift. Designed initially as a high-altitude interceptor, it was reimagined as something more mundane, but far more decisive: a long-range escort, capable of meeting bombers at the edge of enemy territory and staying with them until the fight was done. Its success was not instant, nor uncontested. Early deployments exposed flaws. Pilots distrusted its handling. Mechanics cursed its complexity, but its range changed the geometry of the war. Combat reports from late 1943 and early 1940 reflect a measurable shift. Bomber losses declined where escorts remained present. Enemy fighters were forced to engage on unfavorable terms or disengage entirely. The air battle became less about isolated heroics and more about sustained pressure. Control of the sky was no longer episodic, it was enforced. This evolution carried emotional weight. Bomber crews began to speak of escorts not as distant abstractions, but as guardians aircraft they could see, follow, and trust. Fighter pilots, in turn, carried the burden of staying close, resisting the urge to chase. Knowing their role was protection, not glory, discipline replaced instinct. Survival followed. Yet even as range was conquered, new vulnerabilities emerged. Extended missions pushed pilots to physical limits. Fatigue set in before combat even began. Navigation errors over long distances multiplied consequences. According to medical and operational studies, endurance, not bravery, was becoming the limiting factor. The horizon had been crossed, but it demanded payment. What followed would test whether air power could sustain dominance not just for a mission, but for months on end, whether this sky itself could be held, day after day, without breaking the men who fought in it. The presence of long-range escorts changed the rhythm of the air war almost immediately. Where bomber streams had once thinned under relentless attack, they now advanced behind a moving shield. Enemy fighters were forced into hard choices: engage well-armed escorts on unfavorable terms, or abandon the bombers entirely. Neither option promised easy victory. Combat records from early 1940 foreshow the consequences with cold clarity. Fighter engagements multiplied in number, but shortened in duration. Interceptions became fragmented. Attacks that once arrived in waves now came in bursts, disrupted before momentum could build. Air superiority was no longer seized at the target, it was enforced along the entire route. For bomber crews, the change was profound. Survival no longer felt like a lottery drawn at the edge of enemy territory. Losses still occurred, often sudden, often brutal, but the sense of inevitability eased. Crews reported higher confidence, tighter formation discipline, and fewer panic-driven errors. Morale, fragile but critical, stabilized. For fighter pilots tasked with escort duty, the burden intensified. Missions stretched to the edge of human endurance. Hours passed in cramped cockpits at high altitude, oxygen masks biting into faces, hands numbed by cold. Combat might last minutes or never come at all. The challenge was not aggression, but restraint. Escort pilots were instructed repeatedly to stay close, to resist chasing enemy aircraft that fled the protective envelope. According to unit debriefs, this discipline saved lives, but it ran against every instinct fighter pilots had been trained to trust. Fatigue became the unseen adversary. Extended sorties eroded reaction times. Minor navigation errors compounded across long distances. Weather forecasts, once tolerable uncertainties, became mission-critical variables. A headwind on the return leg could mean ditching at sea or crash landing in friendly territory. Medical officers documented rising exhaustion and stress-related symptoms. Even among veteran airmen, the enemy adapted as well. Defenders shifted tactics, concentrating fighters near takeoff and landing zones where escorts were less effective. Anti-aircraft defenses thickened around predictable routes. According to after-action reports, the air war became less about isolated battles and more about attrition of machines, fuel, and human endurance. Jet aircraft entered this environment as disruptors rather than solutions. Their speed challenged escorts and bombers alike, but their limited endurance confined them to short engagements. They could strike, but not linger. The horizon, once conquered by escorts, remained inaccessible to jets. Airpower had fractured into complementary roles: endurance versus velocity, presence versus shock. Strategically, the implications were decisive. Sustained escort coverage allowed bombing campaigns to intensify, targeting industrial infrastructure with increasing effectiveness. Production lines were disrupted, transportation networks strained. According to post-war assessments, the ability to maintain air superiority deep into enemy territory accelerated systemic collapse, rather than isolated defeat. The human cost persisted. Airfields filled with wounded aircraft and exhausted men. Replacement crews arrived into units already worn thin. Victory in the air did not feel triumphant, it felt necessary, grinding, and relentless. Control of the sky was earned daily, then earned again. By mid-1944, the horizon was no longer a barrier, it was a responsibility. Airpower had proven it could reach anywhere. The question now was whether it could sustain pressure without breaking the systems and people. That made it possible. As endurance reshaped strategy, another force loomed on the edge of relevance: speed. once secondary to range, was about to return with new urgency, carrying consequences that would once again redefine the balance above the battlefield. Western Europe, 1944. The skies are no longer contested in bursts or phases, they are contested constantly. Day after day, aircraft rise, collide, fall, and rise again. Air power has achieved reach and persistence, but now it confronts a new dilemma. When endurance becomes routine, advantage shifts back to speed. Not speed as performance, but speed as surprise, as denial, as a weapon that compresses reaction into irrelevance. For much of the war, speed had been a relative concept. Faster aircraft enjoy better odds, but rarely decisive ones. Engagements still unfolded over minutes, sometimes longer. Pilots spotted each other visually. Choices were made, reversed, recovered from. Even superior fighters could be counted through numbers or positioning. Speed helped, but it did not dominate. That balance began to change as airspace saturated. By 1944, skies over Europe were dense with aircraft, flak, contrails, and radio traffic. Warning times shortened. Radar screens crowded. Interception windows narrowed. According to air defense analyses, seconds now mattered more than formations. Whoever could appear suddenly, strike immediately, and disengage before response could form held an asymmetric advantage. This environment favored a new kind of aircraft. Jets, though still scarce, embodied exactly this logic. Their value lay not in dogfighting elegance, but in timing. They could arrive where piston fighters could not. They could attack bombers before escorts repositioned. They could disengage without pursuit. Speed did not just enhance combat, it collapsed it. Early encounters underscored the shift. Bomber crews reported attacks that defied expectation, interceptors closing from astern, with startling velocity, firing briefly, then vanishing. Escort pilots struggled to respond in time. According to combat reports, traditional interception geometry failed against targets that crossed engagement envelopes faster than they could be tracked. Yet speed introduced its own burdens. Jet pilots operated at the edge of control. Throttle lag punished impatience. High closing speeds left little margin for aiming or correction. Missed passes meant missed opportunities. There was rarely time for a second attack. Training emphasized precision over persistence. One chance, one burst, one exit. Human experience lagged behind technology. Pilots accustomed to reading combat visually now relied on instruments and anticipation. Situational awareness compressed. Errors were amplified. Accidents remained frequent, particularly during landing, where speed offered no protection. According to internal safety reports, non-combat losses among jet units remained alarmingly high. Strategically, speed forced adaptation on both sides. Bomber formations adjusted spacing and defensive fire patterns. Escorts revised patrol altitudes and positions. Air defense networks recalibrated radar queuing and response chains. The sky became less forgiving, less negotiable. Mistakes were no longer costly, they were final. Critically, speed altered psychology. The presence of an enemy that could not be reliably intercepted eroded confidence. Crews described a sense of vulnerability that no formation could eliminate. Even when losses were limited, uncertainty multiplied stress. The sky felt unpredictable, again less controlled, more hostile. Despite this impact, jets remained constrained. Limited numbers, fuel shortages, and maintenance demands prevented mass deployment. Speed without persistence could disrupt, but not dominate. According to post-war evaluations, jets imposed tactical friction rather than strategic reversal. They forced change, but could not yet enforce it. Still, the implication was unmistakable. Air combat was entering a new phase, one where reaction time, not maneuver, defined survival. The old language of dogfights and formations was giving way to something colder, faster, and less forgiving. Speed had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an advantage layered onto air power. It was becoming air power itself. What followed would determine whether this weapon could be scaled. sustained, and ultimately mastered, or whether it would remain a terrifying glimpse of a future that arrived too late. The escalation was not dramatic. It was cumulative. As jet encounters multiplied through late 1944 and early 1945, air forces adjusted not to a single threat, but to a new tempo of war. Speed compressed decision-making until doctrine lagged behind reality. The sky no longer allowed rehearsal. It demanded instinct refined by calculation. For bomber crews, jet attacks felt different from anything before. There was rarely time to brace. Reports describe brief warning shouts over intercoms, flashes in peripheral vision followed by sudden damage. The aircraft that struck them was often gone before defensive gunners could respond. Survival depended less on formation discipline than on dispersion, timing, and sheer chance. Escort pilots adapted by anticipation rather than pursuit. They positioned themselves where jets might appear, not where they were seen. Combat reports emphasize altitude layering and preemptive patrols' efforts to deny jets the conditions they required to attack safely. Success was measured not in kills, but in disruption. Preventing an attack became as valuable as winning one. Jet pilots faced a harsher arithmetic. Limited fuel meant short missions. Every engagement consumed irreplaceable engine hours. A single mistake could strand an aircraft far from safety. Many pilots described the experience as flying on borrowed time, exhilarating, isolating, and unforgiving. According to post-war interviews, confidence in the aircraft often exceeded confidence in the war itself. Industrial reality imposed the final constraint. Speed demanded precision manufacturing. Engines required metals and tolerances increasingly unavailable under bombing pressure. Airframes suffered from stress fractures that demanded constant inspection. According to production records, output never approached levels needed to impose sustained control of airspace. Strategically, jets achieved what numbers could not. They forced the enemy to change. Bomber tactics adjusted. Escort formations evolved. Air defense systems were recalibrated. These adaptations consumed time, resources, and attention-valuable commodities in a total war. But adaptation also neutralized surprise. Once speed was expected, it lost some of its power. The psychological arc mirrored the tactical one. Initial shock gave way to vigilance. Vigilance hardened into routine. Fear remained, but it became managed rather than paralyzing. Airpower absorbed speed as it had absorbed altitude, range, and firepower by restructuring itself around the threat. By the war's end, the verdict was clear. Speed alone could not win control of the sky. It required integration, logistics, training, endurance, and numbers. Jets had arrived too late and into few hands to decide the conflict, but they had irrevocably changed its language. The legacy was immediate and global. Post-war air doctrines placed speed at the center of design philosophy. Interception replaced dogfighting. Reaction time replaced turning radius. The future would belong to those who could see first, arrive first, and leave before response formed. The men who flew these early jets sensed it. Many wrote not of victory or defeat, but of transition. They knew they were crossing a boundary, leaving behind a world where air combat was intimate, and entering one where it would be abstract, instantaneous, and lethal at distance. Speed had proven itself as a weapon. The next question was whether it could be paired with control, whether the sky could be not just struck, but governed. That answer would come as airpower turned from battlefields to borders, from wartime necessity to permanent dominance, ushering in a new era, where the sky itself became a strategic domain. By 1945, the war in the air had crossed an invisible line. Airpower was no longer measured solely by victories won or aircraft destroyed. It was measured by absence, by enemy aircraft that never appeared, by bombers that reached targets unchallenged, by ground forces that moved beneath a sky that no longer threatened them. Control of the air had evolved into something more absolute. The sky was no longer contested. It was owned. This concept had been imagined before the war, but never realized at scale. Pre-war theorists spoke of air superiority as a prerequisite, a condition to be achieved before decisive action elsewhere. In practice, it had proven fleeting in one sector, lost in another, dependent on weather, timing, and chance. Now, sustained escort coverage, integrated radar networks, and overwhelming production had transformed superiority into permanence. The mechanics of this transformation were systemic. Fighters no longer operated as independent hunters, but as components of a coordinated machine. Radar stations detected incoming threats. Command centers directed intercepts. Escorts patrolled assigned volumes of airspace with precision. According to wartime operational summaries, the effectiveness of individual pilots mattered less than the reliability of the system supporting them. Asterisk for the men in the cockpit. This shift altered identity. Fighter pilots who once measured success by kills now measured it by prevention. Bomber crews judged missions not by opposition encountered, but by its absence. The sky, once unpredictable and personal, became procedural. Safety came not from heroism, but from structure. On the ground, the consequences were immediate. Armies advanced under near-constant aerial cover. Supply lines flowed with fewer interruptions. Enemy movement became visible, targetable, and increasingly futile. According to after-action reports, units deprived of air cover experienced accelerated collapse not always from destruction, but from isolation and exhaustion. Asterisk yet ownership of the sky carried its own costs. Maintaining dominance required relentless effort. Aircraft flew even when no enemy appeared. Crews launched to prove presence as much as to fight. Maintenance cycles tightened. Fuel consumption soared. Air superiority was not a state, it was a process that demanded constant reinforcement. Human strain followed. Pilots flew long patrols punctuated by boredom rather than combat. Vigilance replaced adrenaline. Mistakes made in monotony could be as deadly as those made under fire. Medical officers noted fatigue not from terror, but from repetition, the slow erosion of attention in a sky that seemed quiet, but never truly safe. Jets occupied an ambiguous place in this environment. Their speed made them ideal for interception, but their limitations confined them to specific roles. They did not patrol, they responded. According to planning documents, jets were increasingly viewed as guardians of last resort weapons to be launched when the system failed. Not as its foundation, strategically, this reinforced a new hierarchy of air power. Endurance, coordination, and logistics formed the base. Speed and innovation sat atop it, decisive only when integrated. The sky could not be owned by brilliance alone. It required permanence.